During a period of several years, through the early 1940s, tens of thousands of innocent children and concentration camp prisoners were involuntarily subjected to horrific medical experiments, all of which were carried out with the fanatical compliance of German physicians, nurses, and scientists, as well as subjugated Jewish doctors imprisoned in the camps. Founded entirely on Hitler's pseudo-scientific beliefs and utter mythology, these inhuman experiments centered on the creation of a stronger German people, a return to the true Aryan race, superior above all others. While we may use their professional title as a descriptive term, these were not doctors. They were monsters. This is part 1 of the story of the depraved doctors of the Third Reich. Following the end of World War I, Germany suffered severe economic hardship, with insurmountable reparations charged to the nation by the Treaty of Versailles. The German currency became worthless. The German people were starving. For the nations that had lost the war, the dreadful carnage on the battlefield seemed to be a sacrifice paid for nothing in return. For many, the only explanation for German defeat was conspiracy. With interracial and religious conflict dating back far beyond the 20th century, German radicals and defeated German military leadership, the latter seeking to avoid personal consequences for their policies, propagated a stab-in-the-back myth. Through propaganda, they attributed the loss of the war not to the battlefield, but to internal betrayal by traitors working for foreign interests, primarily Jews and communists. Despite being entirely untrue, German radicals now seized on the opportunity to exploit a war-torn nation characterized by resentment and despair. Propaganda insinuated that Jews had conspired to not only instigate the war, to bring about financial and economic ruin, but then to capitalize on it. While Germany began a long and difficult recovery, a rise of diverse political factions and radical ideas about how to rebuild a stronger German nation emerged. One of these groups was Adolf Hitler and his Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or the National Socialist Workers' Party, known more commonly by its abbreviated form, the Nazis. Hitler was seen as a strong leader who was restoring order to the country. By 1933, he and his Nazi party had taken control of Germany. The Nazis soon controlled the majority of German media, newspapers, magazines, books, even children's books and toys, public meetings, rallies, art, music, movies, and radio. Viewpoints in any way threatening to Nazi beliefs or to the regime were censored or eliminated from all media. Hitler began incorporating much of the anti-Jewish rhetoric into the official history of the nation. Indeed, Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, was transmuted into the political horizon of the Third Reich. It was the Nazis' biblical text. In his writing, Hitler elaborated on many of his unfounded scientific and racial beliefs. He divided humans into categories based on physical appearance, establishing higher and lower orders, or types of humans. At the top, according to Hitler, is something he refers to as the Aryan, a healthy Germanic man with fair skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and no genetic defects. Despite lacking any proof of his claims, Hitler believed that the German people were direct descendants of the Aryan race, which was effectively the people of the lost city of Atlantis. And so it follows in Hitler's thinking, if there is a supreme form of human, then there must be others less than supreme, the Untermenschen, or racially inferior. Hitler assigned this position to Jews and the Slavic peoples, notably the Czechs, Poles, and Russians. He believed that the German race, the true Aryans, had been taken in, manipulated by these inferior races of people over the centuries, eventually interbreeding and thus sullying the Aryan bloodline. Hitler sought to reverse this anthropological blunder, a supposed perversion of the natural order. This philosophy by no means believes in an equality of races, he writes, but along with their difference, it recognizes their higher or lesser value and feels itself obligated to promote the victory of the better and stronger and demand the subordination of the inferior and weaker in accordance with the eternal will that dominates this universe. Hitler goes on to say that subjugated peoples actually benefit by being conquered because they come in contact with and learn from the superior Aryans. However, he adds they benefit only as long as the Aryan remains the absolute master and doesn't mingle or intermarry with inferior conquered peoples. But it is the Jews, specifically, Hitler writes, who are engaged in a conspiracy to keep this master race from assuming its rightful position as rulers of the world, by tainting its racial and cultural purity, and even inventing forms of government in which the Aryan comes to believe in equality and fails to recognize his racial superiority. These manipulated views of the country's history, this conspiracy idea, and the notion of competition for world domination between Jews and Aryans would become widespread beliefs in Nazi Germany and would even be taught to school children to indoctrinate them. This, combined with Hitler's racial attitude toward the Jews, would be shared to varying degrees by millions of Germans and people from occupied countries, so that they either remained silent or actively participated in the Nazi effort to exterminate their own Jewish neighbors, and ultimately the entire Jewish population of Europe. Thus began a period of overt racial division within the country, endorsed openly by the National Socialist government. Placing Dr. Joseph Goebbels at the head of the Nazi propaganda ministry, Hitler utilized a combination of media propaganda and political rhetoric of we versus them to firmly convince the Germans that specific races of people were responsible for the country's problems, particularly the economic woes. Writer Ben Irvine summarizes, in Germany, as elsewhere, Hitler insisted these Jewish capitalist hyenas aimed at nothing less than the financial domination of the entire economy. Jewish finance, Hitler warns, demands not only the absolute economic destruction of Germany, but its complete political enslavement. Beginning in 1933, over the next 5 to 6 years, this divisive rhetoric was institutionalized. It was incorporated into the governing philosophy of applied biology, mandating its teaching in public schools and universities. Nazi student organizations, professors, and librarians were quick to tally up long lists of books they thought should not be read by Germans, inciting a raid of libraries and bookstores across the country. The books were eventually ceremonially burned on May 10, 1933. The message was clear. Anything opposing Nazi ideology would be destroyed. Hitler's racist ideas, Aryan myths, and pseudoscience were to be converted into concrete measures, obsessively applied at every level of the state. This was a new Germany, soon to be characterized by racial hygiene laws, persecution, and concentration camps for detaining German enemies and traitors. In pursuit of a stronger German people, even non-Jewish German citizens who failed to live up to the Aryan standard were to be eliminated. As history often demonstrates, the road to hell being paved with good intentions, it would appear that well-meaning intellectuals, professors, scientists, and most particularly the medical profession, played a decisive role in Nazi policies and the implementation of the Holocaust. With the nearly 4,000 Jewish doctors eventually stripped of their ability to practice medicine in Nazi Germany, many among the remaining non-Jewish physicians supported the regime and went on to violate their Hippocratic oaths, performing grotesque experiments and demonstrating incomprehensible levels of brutality in the government-sponsored murder of millions of innocent people. But why? Considering there was no apparent retribution for not joining the Nazi Party, historians argue that these men and women were captivated with the idea of advancing their own professions, as well as the Nazis' intellectual ideologies for improving the human race through science. Effectively, physicians and nurses became agents of the state. No longer caring for their patients, their oath of loyalty was sworn towards their Führer and the health of the nation. So committed to their belief in Hitler's racial pseudoscience and ludicrous anthropological beliefs in Aryan descendants, the Nazis were soon to begin murdering even their own citizens for the sake of a stronger German people. Despite its negative connotations specific to Nazi Germany, the idea of eugenics has long been a popular idea among advancing human civilization. This theory holds that through selective breeding, whether animals or humans, lies the ability to create a stronger species with desirable hereditary traits. At the time Hitler began implementing his own brand of eugenics in Nazi Germany, the study and beliefs in eugenics theory were popular in other leading world nations, in England, the United States, Japan, and Scandinavia, among others. In fact, much of Germany's foundational research into eugenics began in the US, a country which had begun developing eugenics research and health studies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For instance, in the state of Virginia in 1933, sterilization of people was legal under state laws. Mid-1930s U.S. medical journals can even be recounted as containing articles which express a competitive interest in catching up to the Nazis' more progressive eugenics policies during the 1930s. Ironically, during the 1920s and 30s, Germany's medical community was considered the best in the world, the height of scientific and medical advancement. Even by U.S. standards, an accomplished doctor was considered one who had studied in Germany. This arrogance may have prompted a general feeling of superiority, not only within the German medical community, but subsequently throughout the nation. But still, how were thousands of German doctors and nurses led to corrupt their practice and commit millions of murders? With incremental steps which, with proper framing, appear tolerable and even benevolent. Hitler despised anyone he considered unfit to live, including those individuals deemed incurably ill, physically or mentally disabled, emotionally distraught, and elderly. Many of them being unfit to work or provide for themselves. Nazi rhetoric categorized these individuals as burdensome lives. Beginning in 1933, in the interest of preserving hereditary health, the German government promulgated a new law for the forced sterilization of such individuals suffering from a range of disabilities and ailments. Vasectomy was the usual sterilization method for men, and for women, tubal ligation, an invasive procedure that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of women. Following his invasion of Poland, in September of 1939, Hitler sought to take advantage of the cloak of war to further eliminate these unwanted individuals, these useless feeders from German society. The Nazi T4 program, also called the T4 euthanasia program, signaled a period of the accepted practice of not only routine sterilization, but the killing of German children and adults. Physicians active in the study of eugenics, who saw Nazism as applied biology, enthusiastically endorsed this program. School children were even performing mathematical exercises in school to teach them the burdensome costs of keeping and caring for adults and children with disabilities. Now entering into what would become the Second World War, the Nazi government argued they needed to free up all available resources, personnel, and beds in the medical institutions for the disabled to treat the wounded soldiers returning from the front lines. Ironically, so sadistic was the Nazi regime, they inevitably killed many of their own wounded soldiers for the sake of their eugenic policies against the disabled. Doctors and nurses were given free rein in many aspects, as they were encouraged to evaluate and indiscriminately kill any patient they deemed to be suffering, thus justifying the murder with the idea of providing their patients a quick death over a life of doubtless suffering. They embraced the Nazi philosophy of healing through killing. Many of the victims of the T4 program were killed by their own caretakers, either with injections or by luring them into the newly constructed hospital rooms resembling showers, only to be asphyxiated to death with carbon monoxide. As with much of the Nazi propaganda, the term euthanasia was given a more compassionate and acceptable definition, being propagated by German government and the media as a mercy killing for sufferers of incurable ailments and disorders. Falling victim to these lies, blinded by their oath of national loyalty, unwitting German families were manipulated into believing that giving birth to a malformed baby was harmful to the health of the German nation. Midwives and nurses were mandated by German law to report any infant born with a birth defect. The midwives were offered further encouragement by being paid for each child they reported. German parents began relinquishing their afflicted children, young and old, to the nurses and doctors who offered false reassurances, promising them they would get the best care in a government institution. Nurses then put infants in their care out on the hospital veranda to slowly die of hypothermia in the freezing weather. They withheld feeding to starve infants to death, or otherwise fed older children overdoses of sedative medications or sent them to the showers. In court proceedings after the war, nurses were said to speak of how lovingly we held the children while we encouraged them to drink the medication which would kill them. We didn't want them to suffer more than necessary. Each hospital had a department which would write condolence letters to the family, falsely citing natural causes of death for the loss of their family member. Despite moderate attempts to conceal the murders from the communities nearby, the deaths of family members, as well as the billowing smoke from the crematoriums, could not be overlooked. Local communities began recognizing the gray-windowed buses passing by for what they were, transports filled with the disabled, transferring them to the nearby hospitals for their imminent murder. From 1939 until the end of the war in 1945, roughly 400,000 German citizens were sterilized against their will. Nazi doctors and nurses further euthanized 200,000 disabled German children and adults. The simultaneous construction of crematoriums and gas chambers in Germany foreshadowed the unspeakable number of murders which were to occur before the end of the war. And what makes genocide an easier task? The systematic dehumanization of the entire group to be eliminated. The widespread German acceptance of the Aryan myth and the ongoing normalization of anti-Semitism was part of a larger plan. Nazis wanted the complete eradication of Jewish people from the country, and then Europe. From 1933 to 1938, the Nazi Party and its supporters implemented a systematic level of restrictions designed to impoverish Jews and prevent them from participating in the German economy by requiring them to register their property and preventing them from earning a living. In late 1935, laws were passed to revoke Jewish citizenship and to prevent Jews from marrying or having sexual relations with persons of German or related blood. Germans themselves were encouraged to marry only those with desirable hereditary traits, and were even required to obtain a certificate of fitness from public health authorities before they could marry. Even those German citizens who did not fully accept the Nazi propaganda about their Jewish neighbors still avoided them for fear of being reported for illegal fraternization. During this period of increasing anti-Semitism, characterized by flagrant murders, abuse, plundering, and burning of Jewish synagogues and properties, many Jews decided to leave Germany as quickly as possible. While many did attempt to emigrate, a significant number were either unsuccessful or stayed in Germany with the hope of keeping their family together, or of finding a way to live, even under the brutal circumstances. In accordance with Nazi propaganda, a message of German overpopulation and the need for a superior race to have room to grow justified German expansion into neighboring territories. With these geographic expansions, as many Jews as had escaped Germany were now being increasingly repopulated by those Jews residing in the now Nazi-occupied territories. Despite his overt racial beliefs, Hitler understood the political implications of outright murder. After all, Jewish people had served in the German military during World War I. They had lived side by side with the non-Jewish population. It could not be overlooked if hundreds of thousands of people were simply being rounded up and disappearing. Unsettling rumors of Nazi exterminations of Jews were already beginning to cause unrest throughout the German citizenry. This was, after all, one of the elite nations of the world. Thus, a preliminary policy measure of out of sight, out of mind was employed. The Jewish people remaining in Germany and its occupied regions were forced from their homes, separated from the rest of the population, so that they may be forgotten by their German neighbors, now consolidated far away into filthy and overcrowded ghettos. While Nazi leadership deliberated on this Jewish problem, the Jewish people were now subjected to living conditions which were nothing less than miserable. Beginning in 1941, Hitler's final solution began its implementation as the Jewish ghettos were systematically emptied and destroyed, their occupants either being shot and buried in mass graves nearby, or deported by train to forced labor and concentration camps. Now presented with an unequal opportunity for genetic research and the advancement of the German master race through the study of eugenics, Nazi doctors were given positions of authority in many of these camps. Again, they were given the power to choose who among their charges would live and who would die. Doctors were made responsible for the supervision of the selections, gassings, and the killings. Corrupted by their blind loyalty and subjective fascinations with new science, they did not hesitate to use prisoners held in several concentration camps as guinea pigs. Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, Neuengamme, Mauthausen, Natzweiler, Stutthof. At the summit of this policy of dehumanization, Auschwitz.